All right, this is the true story of esports. This is going to be mostly anecdotal, but I think it will give you a lot of insight. This is something that I wish that I had before I spent 10,000 hours grinding Halo 5 trying to become a competitive esports player. This is something I wish I had known, and I'm hoping can at least save some of you some time if you're considering pursuing esports as a job. If you play video games enough, you'll probably get to a point where you've played and you've gotten good enough that you start playing against professional players in whatever esport genre that you're trying to compete in. You want to compete in first-person shooters, you might run into people in Apex and you might be a Predator, or if you're in Halo, you might be in, High Onyx, early champion. If you're competing in Call of Duty, well, Call of Duty is kind of weird now because CDL kind of has a ring of competitors. But regardless, you get to a point where you've played so much of your video game that you're competitive, you're good. But every one of those games and every one of the multiplayer games were designed in such a way that they require a full team. And it does not matter how good you are as an individual, a team of above average players against a team with one really awesome player and a bunch of players that are a little subpar are going to lose almost every time. Occasionally, you will get into a first-person shooter game where the game is such that a really good player can rise above a team and be competitive. For example, I competed in Halo 5 for 6 years. When I say for 6 years, I mean the reality is that I competed for about 3 years. And the thing was I had multiple spine surgeries, I had time to play video games, and I thought, hey, here I am competing against professional players in an arena in which I was sometimes trading games with pro players. Now, it was always set up in such a way that it would be matchmaking for the most part. And matchmaking was set up initially where it was actually a pretty good indication as to where you sit in the pack of players. There was a top 200 players that would get ranked champion, and then there would be, everybody else below that. Well, the thing about it is that most of the real growth in the game, as you got better as far as skill is concerned, is all surrounded around custom games and getting in custom game lobbies with players that are actually competitive. So what that means for you as an individual player is that the only way in which you're going to get better is if you're playing in these competitive lobbies, these custom game lobbies. So the first part that you have to get past, and that's the hardest part, is getting past the clout gatekeepers. And they're the people that assign an invisible score number on whether or not that they think that you are good enough to play in the lobby to begin with. So for example, if there's one professional lobby and an amateur lobby going, of the amateur players that are online at the time, you have to be selected or assigned a clout number despite what your rank says online, because your rank doesn't actually matter. The custom game lobby and experience of who you know in the lobby and how long you've been competing matter a lot more than your individual rank. So as a result, what that means is that you have to get selected and pass the gatekeepers initially. That is the hardest step, especially considering any person, regardless of whether or not you're absolutely dominating in matchmaking, no one cares about your matchmaking stats. The only thing they care about is whether or not you would work well enough with them, or whether or not they'd even consider playing with you. So that's the first and hardest thing. And most of the thing that bears and bars you from even playing with these people is whether or not they like you as a person. It's really, really, really funny. There was this guy named Vader who played with Shotzi, and Shotzi was an unbelievable Halo 5 player. He was probably the best Halo 5 player to ever touch the sticks. He was a world champion on world champion status. Just by having Shotzi on your team meant there was a tournament that was done at one point where a team of 3 players that had consistently placed in the top 32 played with Shotzi on their team in a tournament and ended up placing top top 8 above a different team that had typically placed top 8. They made that team place top 16 for that tournament, and it actually very much hurt them in the next LAN event as a result of it. But regardless, and the reason that I'm getting on the Shotzzy soapbox is to explain the fact that him being in the lobby to begin with meant that this guy named Vader would end up getting to play in professional lobbies just because of the friendship that had occurred between Shotzzy and Vader. That friendship alone would allow him to jump the line despite the skill level of the lobby being much higher than his actual ability. But the hardest part about all of this is that your performance in the game is very much dictated based off how your team chooses to play with you. Like, there will be times you will get in a scenario in which you have good teammates against another good team, but because everyone is always worried about their own statistics on how they did during the game, how many kills they got, how many deaths they got, how you did, they will play in ways that are abnormal to the way that they would actually play the match in a competitive setting for the sole purpose of boosting their stats and baiting the fuck out of you. Sorry, I said that pretty bluntly. But people will play very differently for the sole purpose of pride, so that they can, at the end of the match, they don't even care whether or not they win. They just care that people look at their statistics at the end of the match and they say, ha, look at my clout. I'm so amazing. Look at my stats. Your stats suck. And you'll see all this like bickering back and forth whether or not you won or lost. And it's all about, oh, well, I baited you for 30 kills and you got 30 assists, but you died 35 times and I died only 5 because played differently. Well, that's what makes this whole thing so difficult, is that all these matches and these lobbies are occurring with players that you probably will never team with. When it comes tournament time and it comes time to actually start selecting teams and starting to grind, the thing is most of these amateur and competitive lobbies, no one really even likes each other. They're all competing against each other all the time, and they really, since they don't like each other, they'll play in these lobbies and then they'll team with each other based off of who's available and whether or not the people that they're actually friends with want to team, or whether or not they already have a team that's placing really well. So for example, let's say I'm team number 1. I'm the best team in the game. I've practiced. We've got 4 players that are all placing top 1. We're the best in the game. We're the best team in the game. Well, as long as we're the best team in the game, we're not going to change. But if we're team number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, well, now there's this incentive after every event to change the roster in order to try to get a better fit or try to get a better way of like competing. Well, that's true for all the like higher up people who are actually like practicing as teams and running scrims. But for the amateur scene, that's almost non-existent. Most amateur teams are put together literally like a week or 2 before the event, and most of them won't even play with all 4 players on at the same time because they all have a job and other things going on with their lives. They can't just focus on playing the game and working out strategies and working out kinks against real teams. That's why there's this one team in Halo that I respect them more than anybody, but they hate my guts. And it's kind of weird because like the thing is there's this team, I think it's Anvor, Talak, Mr. Soul Snipe, and Druck. And the thing about these players is they're all friends. And they are all friends, and they placed like top 32 for a while. Top 32, then they would place top 16, and then they slowly inched their way up, but they stuck together regardless of the fact that they weren't winning, but they practiced together, and they showed people that if you actually get 4 people who are dedicated enough together, who want to win and want to compete and want to make it their job, you can do it. But it requires 4 people who all listen to each other, that actually like each other. It's so difficult to find that though. Like that's like almost like a one of a kind, like, friendship kind of thing. Like, it almost doesn't happen. And it's crazy because, like, when I was competing, that was all I ever wanted. I honestly didn't even care. There were times I would play as selfless as possible because I honestly just, all I wanted was to create a team and compete and make it my job. That's all I wanted. But the thing was, it was impossible to do that because the other people that you would maybe team with always, like, wanted to find a reason to, like, cut you down so that they could maybe get on a team instead of you. And instead of working with you and trying to become your friend, if you message them, they would ego you. And even though you were on the same skill level or, like, maybe a little bit below their skill level, you were still, like, in a respectable range. It wasn't like when I would message some of these people that, like, I was like a bronze player, like messaging someone trying to, like, play above my skill level. Like, I was trying to play with, like, people in my skill bracket, but it didn't matter that even if I was a little bit below or they were a little bit below, none of that mattered. It was more about the relationships and about whether or not if you fit into their circle of friends. And it has almost nothing to do with your individual skill and your dedication and how bad you want it. You could want it so badly that that's all you want to do. But it is all about your friend groups. And that's the hardest part about the whole thing. And that's the hardest part about esports, is finding the people that are willing to leave their friend groups, or at least set their friend groups aside in order to, like, attempt to, like, bring in other players that they wouldn't normally play with that actually want it. That's what makes esports so difficult. And so, like, what I realized, and I made a lot of mistakes as I was trying to navigate and figure out what this esports thing was all about. Some of those mistakes being attempting to message people too soon prior to, like, actually developing friendships, and not actually just trying to meet them organically, because in my mind, when I wanted to do esports, I had a window. My life was on hold, and I felt like I needed to start developing those relationships now and as instantly as possible. And I didn't have time to wait. Like, I didn't have time to start, like, okay, I'm gonna play these matches, now I'm gonna get in these custom games, and I'm gonna try to do this, and I'm gonna try to do that. And I did everything I thought I could, but the thing that I started to do, and I started to try to, like, I became as callous as the people that had egoed me. I started to develop an ego, because you kind of have to have an ego in a little bit, because the thing is you only have a finite amount of time when you get on the game. So you can't be bothering with, like, you know, playing with frickin' bronze players when you're in champion. Like, you're gonna lose every game, and you know you're gonna lose every game. But it's so hard because, like, you are gonna have days, especially if you're competitive video games get incredibly frustrating, especially the longer that you play, the more you play, the little bugs that happen in the game become more and more irritating. You have to create some level of shield in order to, like, not play with the people that are inviting you 24/7, that you obviously, if you play with them, you're literally just losing brain cells because they make the same mistakes over and over again. And no matter how many times you teach them or try to explain to them that if you block that spawn, you lose the game, they just don't get it. I get that. But the thing about all of that is that as I started to develop an ego and I started to, like, center myself around certain people of certain skill levels, I kind of got pushed into a crowd that was incredibly toxic. They were really good at Halo, but they were incredibly toxic to the point where they ended up even shading me.
Betrayal.
For one of the biggest last tournaments of the entire game. And the thing is I had been around these toxic people for so long that I started to talk like them and I started to think like them. And I made some incredibly big mistakes. Like, I said things that I would never say under any other circumstances. And it took me being away from that for over a year to reprogram my mind from thinking the thoughts and the things that they would say on a regular basis. Because you don't realize it, but over time, you start to become the people you hang around. And yes, they might be really awesome at the video game you want to compete in, and they may feel like your only chance and choice of playing with actually be competitive. But like, you need to make sure that if in fact you do end up in a competitive scenario where the people that you're playing with are incredibly toxic and maybe racist, or maybe say things that you wouldn't normally say, you got to make sure that you can develop a decompression and at least have a group and an anchor of people in your life that are at least pouring into you in a positive way while you're trying to pursue esports. I recommend finding a church, finding some people that are bringing you words of encouragement, because it can get dark. And that's the hardest part, is that like a lot of people that play video games 24/7 develop some semblance of like depression and mental illness. Like, it's actually like a study. Like, look at these people that are competing, like look at the way that they operate and that they interact with people, and like some of the depression. Like, I remember going to my very first Halo event, and I was hearing from one of my teammates that one of them wanted to jump off one of the bridges in the hotel and see if they could fly, and they wanted to end the game of life that they were playing. I'm thinking to myself, wow, you have it all made. You're making money. This is your job. And yet you are the most unhappy you've ever been. And I was at a complete disconnect, because at the time I was making no money, and I was in between surgery after surgery for my spine. And I'm looking at these people and I'm thinking, how in the world could you be this depressed? You literally have it made. I would do almost anything to be where you're at right now. But I realized, like, that's actually part of the battle, and there needs to be, if in fact you choose to pursue esports, you need to look at finding a counselor or finding someone to like talk to and work through some of those. I mean, if you're spending 8 hours on a video game with toxic people that are constantly talking about each other behind each other's backs, and you're always worried about whether or not, like, some people will literally start a rumor behind your back and you have no idea that there's even a rumor until one of your friends let you in on the fact that like someone started a rumor at one point that I didn't pay somebody in a Money 2 series, and they tried to cancel me for it. And I thought to myself, like, one, it was never true. And there was even a Money 2 series that I played in where I bet somebody like $200, and then they backed it up and said it was only $50. Like there were so many things that people would say, and then it would get spread around the community like wildfire, because everyone talks to each other. And it's like high school. Everybody thinks that they know everything about every other person. So if anybody's name gets brought up, there's this like plethora of information that you don't know whether or not you can even validate. And it's crazy, because like, I bet you anything, if anybody ever realizes who I am from the Halo community, they already have preconceived notes and thoughts and ideas about me. Now, it may sound like I've taken a very dark and cynical look at esports. The reality is there are also some incredibly redeeming aspects of esports. Some of them being, I have had some of the most incredible moments of my life in playing on LAN against a team, being there in person with no lag, and experiencing a reverse sweep where you can see the entire momentum of the way that your team is performing together, and you can accomplish a reverse sweep and coming out victorious on what initially looked like a series that you were going to lose in less than 30 minutes. And those can be some incredibly rewarding moments, and there can be some incredibly great and memories that I will never forget for the rest of my life. But for me personally, with the gatekeepers and the way that esports is currently being run, there's a very good reason as to why it appears as though certain individual players are able to continue to compete year after year in whatever esport genre that they would like to compete in. They can bounce back and forth because everyone knows that has been competing in esports for as long as they have that the skill level can be learned, but it only can be learned in these closed circuits and circles of truly competitive players. And being able to just get in and practice with these competitive players is something most amateur players will never get to even experience. I've had certain moments where I did get to experience it, and there's absolutely nothing like it. The problem I always had was that it could never be consistent. I would have some days where I would get a chance to prove myself and play in incredibly competitive matches, and I had some of the most fun I've ever had in my entire life. But at the other side of the coin, those moments were also filled with lulls and waiting for teams who are milking the lobby for the sole purpose of waiting for their Adderall to kick in so that they can throw you off your game. The stuff that's happening, it can be an incredibly rewarding thing, but you just have to make it past the gatekeeper. And for most people, if you're choosing to pursue esports as a career, you don't even really get a say whether or not that actually happens. You only get that opportunity if someone chooses to extend their hand down and come down to meet a mere mortal such as yourself and decides to say, hey, come along for the ride. I really like you. I think we could work well together. And that just doesn't happen every day.